Today's conversation is going to be centered on General Eisenhower's report to Congress after World War II ended in Europe. On June 18, 1945, General Eisenhower delivered a report on the war before a joint session of the House and Senate. General Eisenhower had recently returned from the United States from his active duty service in Europe, where he led the Allied forces as Supreme Commander. Congress welcomed the war hero home with thunderous applause, you can imagine. In his report, Eisenhower applauded the leadership of President Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. He recognized the contributing efforts of the United States Navy and Air Force, as well as the militaries of several countries, including Britain and the Soviet Union. He commended the American fighting man, highlighting the outstanding performance of American soldiers, as well as acknowledging the heavy losses they faced. It was an important moment where we were reminded that our military works for our elected leadership. And so General Eisenhower was making that report to Congress. As we always remind people, Article 1 of the United States Constitution, which is why the United States Capitol Historical Society was created over 60 years ago, to tell the stories of the Capitol and the people who work in it in a manner that fosters informed patriotism. No one had a stronger urge to patriotism or demonstrated will to make that possible for all of us than General Eisenhower. Today's speaker, Dr. Arrington, has been someone who has been telling public history for 25 years, as he has managed and led historic sites for the National Park Service. Most recently, fondly to me, he was in Cleveland area, managing the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. In various roles there since 2009, he has overseen all aspects of the operation, including the programming, the communications, and the partnerships. We welcome the Clevelander here to Washington and to participation with the Society. Dr. Arrington previously held appointments at the Homestead National Monument of America in Nebraska and the Eisenhower National Historical Site in Pennsylvania. He has served in temporary leadership assignments at institutions including the Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio and the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument in Montana. Dr. Arrington's scholarship includes publications on topics such as the American Civil War and the early Republican Party. His book, The Last Lincoln Republican, The Presidential Election of 1880, was published by the University Press of Kansas in September 2020. He's taught history and humanities courses at several colleges in Northeast Ohio, including Lake Erie College, John Carroll University, and provides scholarly commentary on C-SPAN, Radio Free Europe, and National Public Radio. We are honored that Dr. Arrington is here to talk to us about Eisenhower reporting back to Congress on the mission in Europe. Please tell us, Dr. Arrington. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for welcoming me here today. I appreciate the recitation there of that long biography. I'm very pleased to now, for the last year or so, be the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home in beautiful Abilene, Kansas. And that is where I am coming to you from today. The office that I occupy as the director of this institution, which you can see some of behind me if you can see me, actually is the office that was built here for President Eisenhower when this building was constructed and dedicated in 1962. So it's very it's such an honor for me to come to work every day in this beautiful space, and to as you heard in my bio, my affinity for the Eisenhowers goes back 30 years. to the summer of 1995, when I was a seasonal park ranger at Eisenhower National Historic Site in Gettysburg. And so now to be here as the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, it's kind of a full circle moment for me with Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. So it's a thrill to be on with you today. What I'm going to do, as you heard in the intro, is I'm going to talk about the speech that Eisenhower gave to Congress on June 18th, 1945. I'm also going to talk about a few other events and things that were related to that and kind of got Eisenhower to where he was in that he was addressing a session of Congress in 1945. So I'm going to start a little before that and make my way forward. And then I'm going to give you, read you some excerpts from the speech that I think touch on many of the things that Jane mentioned in that very nice introduction about some of the things Eisenhower said about the Allies and the other countries and the American fighting men that won the war in Europe. But I also want to point out how some of these things really affected Eisenhower through the rest of his public career. He, of course, later was the president of Columbia University, then the first Supreme Commander of NATO, and then, of course, the 34th President of the United States. So some of the things he says in this speech are very much relevant to some of those future duties that he took on, including as president. So when we get to the end, I'll try to kind of wrap it up and tell you a few things that I think we've learned about Eisenhower through the course of this speech. But before I get, and I should mention that the slide you're seeing there, this is a photo from the speech that General Eisenhower gave on June 18th, 1945, which is the subject of our program today. Before I delve into that specific speech in June of 1945, I want to give you a little bit of background on General Eisenhower and the way that he did things as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II. What you're seeing on the screen there is, of course, the very famous photo of General Eisenhower talking to paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division before they load onto planes to go jump into Normandy prior to the invasion on June 6, 1944. The airborne operation was critical to the success of the D-Day landings. And I'll explain more about that here in just a moment. But the quote that you see there on the screen is taken from Eisenhower's order of the day that all troops from all nations that were taking part in the Normandy invasion were given really as they were loading onto ships or loading onto planes. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. So Eisenhower was, of course, had been working with many others to plan this invasion for about a year when it finally began in June of 1944. As I mentioned a moment ago, the airborne operations were really critical here in that for the troops that were going to be hitting the beaches, Omaha, Utah, Sword, Gold, and Juneau on D-Day, to be able to move off the beaches and move further inland to continue the invasion. There were these, what they called causeways, that needed to be seized. A lot of this ground was very kind of swampy and marshy, and these causeways were the only ways that the troops would be able to move not only themselves, but also equipment, tanks, trucks, all of these things that the Allies needed to land in order to make it for a successful invasion. So the airborne operations the airborne paratroopers were being dropped to seize those causeways so that by the time that the troops hit the beach on the morning of June 6th, the causeways had already been taken and were being held by the Allies and were open to move equipment further inland. Shortly before the airborne drops on D-Day, Trafford Lee Mallory, who was the air chief, who was British, the air chief for the invasion, wrote to Eisenhower and said that he felt that the airborne drops were going to be a disaster. The airborne was going to lose 80 to 90% of their men in casualties, and that he suggested that they not conduct the airborne operation. Eisenhower listened to this view. He talked to the commanders that were going to be on the ground going in with the troops on the beaches, And those troop commanders were convinced that the causeways were absolutely essential to the success of this operation. So Eisenhower responded to Lee Mallory by basically saying, I appreciate the analysis and your view. The commanders on the ground tell me that the causeways are critical. We have to proceed with the airborne drops. And he told Lee Mallory that this is my decision. If anything goes wrong, it's on me, not on you. Eisenhower then sat down and wrote what's known as the in case of failure message. And this original piece of paper is in our collection here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. He wrote this knowing that Lee Mallory's assessment was that the airborne was potentially going to lose 80 to 90% of their force. He wrote this message just in case that the landings were unsuccessful. And this was something this was like basically a statement that would be released in case the landings did not succeed. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner, he actually misdated the in case of failure message July 5th rather than June 5th. And we attribute that to just extreme exhaustion and stress, and the fact that this was written very quickly. Eisenhower wrote that message, put it in his pocket, and then went and visited with the 101st Airborne. So he went to the 101st Airborne knowing that it was possible that 80 to 90% of the men he was talking to would not survive. And I'll go back here just a moment, and I want to tell you there's a great story about this photo. If you've ever been here, you know the story, but if you haven't, maybe you don't. The gentleman, the lieutenant right here in front of Eisenhower is wearing the number 23 around his neck. That's a guy by the name of Lieutenant Wallace Strobel. And Strobel was from Saginaw, Michigan. And when Eisenhower went to visit the troops that day, he wasn't talking to them about the operation. He was trying to be casual, lighthearted, and just get to know them a little bit. And so he happened to stop in front of, Lieutenant Strobel and ask him where he was from. And Lieutenant Strobel said, Michigan, sir. And Eisenhower said, oh, Michigan, yeah, there's some great fishing up there. And so the photo that you see here, probably the most iconic image of all of World War II, where Eisenhower looks like he's, cheering on the troops to go win the war. In fact, he's making a casting motion with his hand there. He's talking about fishing. And Strobel, who fortunately did survive the war, told that story, later in life that, somebody asked him, what was Eisenhower saying to you this day? And Strobel said, oh, he was talking about the fishing in Michigan. So that's a great story from that photo. The other great story out of that photo is that very uniform that Lieutenant Strobel is wearing with the number 23 around his neck, he gave to this institution later in life. And that is now in our museum. So if you come to our museum here in Abilene, Kansas, you'll see that. Another important moment that, and I should add that the airborne really ended up with about 10% casualties. So it was far more successful than the assessment that Trafford Lee Mallory had given to Eisenhower. To his credit, Lee Mallory wrote back to Eisenhower and said, I was wrong, you were right, and I've never been so happy to be wrong. So this is another important instance that's leading up to Eisenhower speaking to Congress in June 1945. On April 12th, 1945, Eisenhower toured Ohrdruf, which was a Nazi concentration camp. And this was the first concentration camp that had been liberated by American troops. So Eisenhower toured the camp that day, and he wrote a very famous note back to General George Marshall in Washington, D.C., describing the visit to Ohrdruf. And you see in the photo there, he's walking through Ohrdruf on that day. I should note, too, this is the very same day that President Franklin D. Roosevelt died and Vice President Harry Truman became president. But anyway, from the language of Eisenhower's note to General Marshall, the things I saw beggar description. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda. Eisenhower was aware that the the savagery and the depravity of the concentration camps was so extreme that people would perhaps not believe it. And so he wanted to make sure he saw what was going on in the camps, so that he could refute anybody who ever said this didn't really happen, this was propaganda. And so this is an important moment for Eisenhower as well. If you ever go to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., this quote from General Eisenhower is actually on the outside of the building. So you will see that again if you ever get to visit that museum. Then, of course, we have the German surrender. This is a copy also in our collection here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. This is the actual telegram that General Eisenhower sent back to General Marshall upon the German surrender. And this is just quintessential Eisenhower, because there's no chest thumping, there's no celebrating. He simply says, the mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7th, 1945. That's it. He obviously has a lot more to say in the speech that he gives to Congress, which we'll talk about here shortly. But at any rate, this was quintessential Eisenhower, and that it was just very short, to the point, no bragging or anything like that, just letting General Marshall know that victory in Europe had been achieved. So about a month after victory in Europe, Eisenhower began sort of the process of getting back to the United States. He would, of course, later return to Europe as the first commander of the German occupation of Germany, the Allied occupation of Germany. But he did make this trip back to the United States in June. Before he made it back to the States, he stopped in London, where he was received as a hero. And he gave another famous address on June 12th, 1945, known as the Guildhall Address. And he made this in the presence of Winston Churchill and the mayor of London and all kinds of other important Londoners. And he said a number of important things here that kind of tie into what he later says to the speech to Congress. Humility must always be the portion of any man who receives a claim earned in blood of his followers and sacrifices of his friends. Basically acknowledging that, many, many men had to die for him to be there that day. This is a great line that we love here at the library. I am not a native of this land, meaning not a native of Great Britain. I come from the very heart of America, which is true. Abilene, Kansas, where we're located, is not very far from the geographic center of the United States. I come from the very heart of America to preserve his freedom of worship, his equality before the law, his liberty to act and speak as he sees fit, subject only to provisions that he trespass not upon similar rights of others. A Londoner will fight, so will a citizen of Abilene. So basically what Eisenhower is saying here is that, there are things worth fighting for. And Londoners proved that, Americans proved that during World War II, that there are certainly things worth fighting for, and that he recognized that. Also from the Guildhall Address, my most cherished hope is that after Japan joins the Nazis in utter defeat, neither my country nor yours need ever again summon its sons and daughters from their peaceful pursuits to face the tragedy of battle. But neither London nor Abilene, sisters under the skin, will sell her birthright for physical safety, her liberty for mere existence. We'll talk more as we go through about Eisenhower's desire to be remembered as a man of peace rather than a man of war. That carried through his presidency as well. But here he is again saying that, of course, we all want peace, but there are certain things that everyone has to be willing to fight for. So now we transition to the actual address to Congress on June 18th, 1945. And this will be sort of the rest of the presentation here as we move through. Again, a number of great quotes from this speech that I'll share with you, and then talk a little bit about what did these mean exactly for Eisenhower, and how did these things that he talked about stay with him as he moved through the rest of his career. So this is General Eisenhower talking to members of Congress. 3 million American citizens at your behest have faced resolutely every terror the ruthless Nazi could devise. I come before you as the representative of those 3 million people, their commander, because to them you wish this morning to pay the tribute of a grateful America for military victory. In humble realization that they who earned your commendation should properly be here to receive it, I am nevertheless proud and honored to be your agent in conveying it to them. So this is going to establish a pattern in this speech and in future careers for Eisenhower, where he's very, very active in giving credit to other people, to other allies. In this case, he's basically saying, the people who really deserve your acclaim are the soldiers, but since they cannot all be here, I am here to receive your accolades on their behalf. Here he compliments the American troops that served under his command. He was, of course, the commander of not only the operation into Normandy, D-Day, but also Operation Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa in 1943. And here he says, I have seen the American proved on the battlegrounds of Africa and Europe, over which armies have been fighting for more than 2,000 years of recorded history. None of these battlefields have seen a more worthy soldier than the trained American. Again, talking about the quality of not only the training, but the skill of troops in battle. This is a photo from our collection showing an American soldier during the Battle of the Bulge, and you can see the bodies of enemy soldiers in the background. Here is Eisenhower talking about sort of paying compliment and tribute to President Roosevelt, who of course had died really just 2 months before Eisenhower stood before Congress to make this speech. The real beginning for us, meaning the United States, of course, was in December 1941, when our late great war leader, President Roosevelt, met with his friend Prime Minister Churchill and forged a definition of Allied organization and directional method for the prosecution of this war. So compliments here to Prime Minister Churchill as well, who of course also worked very, very closely with Eisenhower, and he and Eisenhower became very close friends. In fact, in my office here, which you can't see in the background, I actually have a painting on the wall that Churchill painted and gave to Eisenhower as a gift. So here Eisenhower is acknowledging the importance of the American-British relationship and the American-British command structure that was set up that eventually did bring about victory in Europe. In no place was this vital unity more strikingly evidenced than among the individuals that served as my principal commanders and on my staff. British and Americans forgot differences in customs and methods, even in national prejudice, in their devotion to a common cause. Often I have thanked a kind providence for these staunch allies, from highest commanders to the newest recruit, for their willingness to their readiness to serve within the team. So again, an acknowledgement of that important and special relationship that the United States had with Great Britain and continues to have even to this day. And the photo you see there is a photo from June 18th, 1945, showing General Eisenhower standing before Congress. Continuing on here, Eisenhower begins the process of giving credit and compliments to the various branches of the military. In this case, the Navy. The Navy's task in gaining our first European footholds was a staggering one. In all the brilliant achievements of the American Navy and of her sister service in Great Britain, there is none to excel the record that was written in the great and successful invasions of Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. This is another image from our collection. This is a map showing the invasion routes into Normandy, showing the beaches there. And of course, the U.S. Navy was heavily involved in ferrying troops from England across the English Channel and to make the invasion into Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. To the Air Forces, without whose service all else would have been futile, all of us owe similar debts of gratitude. This is a photo from the Museum of the U.S. Air Force. The U.S. Air Force didn't exist at this point. The Air Force was part of the Army. It was called, at that point, the Army Air Corps. But here, General Eisenhower is again complimenting the pilots and the mechanics and the bombardiers and everybody, the navigators, everybody who served in the Army Air Corps at that point, which would later become the Air Force. And of course, American bombers and English bombers as well, flying over Europe and bombing targets. Also, the planes that that flew the airborne troopers that Eisenhower was talking to in that first photograph we saw across the English Channel, so they could jump into Normandy to participate in that critical airborne operation to seize those causeways. So again, complimenting here all of the various services that took part in victory in Europe. I've spoken mostly of Americans and British because troops from this country and the British Empire always formed the bulk of my own command. But the campaigns of the Red Army, crushing all resistance in the East, played a decisive part in the defeat of Germany. Of course, Eisenhower later, as president, was serving in the midst of the Cold War. Relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union prior to World War II was not a great one. Still one of mutual distrust and antagonism. During the war, the U.S. and the Soviet Union put these differences aside to serve as allies in the effort to defeat the Nazis. Stalin, of course, had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, a couple of years before World War II, before the beginning of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which started in June of 1941. So Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler then broke the pact, invaded the Soviet Union, and at that point, the Soviets began fighting Nazi Germany. And then, of course, it basically created a two-front war for Hitler. And so he had the Americans and British coming at him from the West and the Soviets coming at him from the East. So even though Eisenhower eventually, does have a difficult relationship with the Soviet Union as president, he's complimenting the Soviets here in basically acknowledging that their contribution fighting on the Eastern Front was just as important as the American and British and Allied contribution fighting on the Western Front. So giving good compliments here to the Soviets as well. This map that you see on the screen, this is another piece from our collection. This is European Theater of Operations map, an American map, and it shows the final dispensation of troops on May 7th, May 8th, 1945, which of course was Victory in Europe Day when Germany surrendered. The liberated countries of Europe have played a part in fashioning the victory. France's own resistance forces and some of her own divisions took a notable part in driving out the enemy. France, of course, the Normandy coast of France is where the D-Day invasion took place. The Nazi Germany had taken over France several years before, so the Americans and the Allies were there to liberate France. And then, of course, the French resistance played an incredibly important role both in Africa and in France. So here he's acknowledging the contributions of the French and noting how important their contributions were as well. And you see the photo there of American troops marching down the Champs-Élysées upon the liberation of Paris. Every American soldier has seen the toll that war has extracted from France. Even now, although the guns are silent, the urgent necessities of our redeployment to the Pacific make it impossible to do all that we would wish toward improving the trying conditions in which the French people live. So Eisenhower basically here kind of reinforcing the idea that the French and the Americans are friends, and the American troops wish they could do more for France right now. The redeployment to the Pacific does not happen. That ends up not happening because, of course, the Japanese end up surrendering in August of 45. So troops from the European Theater of Operations did not have to redeploy to the Pacific. But at this point, Eisenhower did not know that they would not have to do that. So he was preparing for that eventuality as well, that Americans from the European theater would have to be transferred to fight in the Pacific theater as well, which again never happened because of the use of the atomic bombs. This feeling extends also to Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, which endured 4 years of German tyranny. Our sympathy was aroused, and tons of food were dropped by parachute to alleviate their suffering. Those countries still need and deserve our help. So Eisenhower's kind of fashioning a view here of what the post-war world should look like in his view, and the fact that these countries that have been devastated by World War II in Europe will still need and deserve help from the United States. The United States, of course, was fortunate in World War II. Its own borders were never attacked. There were no invasions of the mainland United States. Most of the European countries, Western European countries, were not that fortunate. So here Eisenhower is stating that there's still going to be a lot of work to do to rebuild these countries and put Europe back together following the end of the war. But even the banners of triumph cannot hide from our sight the sacrifices in which victory has been bought. The hard task of a commander is to send men into battle, knowing some of them, often many, must be killed or wounded in order that necessary missions may be achieved. This really strikes back to what I was talking about at the beginning with the correspondence between Trafford Leigh-Mallory and General Eisenhower, talking about the possibility of 80 to 90% casualties among the airborne paratroopers that were going to be dropping into France prior to Normandy. And again, Eisenhower recognizing that visiting the 101st Airborne, he may be visiting soldiers, 80 to 90% of whom might be killed. So that's always the something that a military commander must face, is the fact that he will have to often send troops into battle, knowing that some of them will not return. And this is a continuation right from the same lines there in the speech. It is a soul-killing task, referring to having to send soldiers into battle, knowing that many will die. My sorrow is not only for the fine young lives lost or broken, but it is equally for the parents, the wives, and the friends who have been bereaved. The price they pay is possibly the greatest. The blackness of their grief can only be relieved by the faith that all this shall not happen again. This is really a wish for the future on Eisenhower's part, that there won't be another war, that there won't be another need to send young Americans into battle to fight to preserve liberties or to liberate other countries. And again, he wanted to be remembered as a man of peace, not as a man of war. And statements like this really, you can see later, sort of guiding him in his presidency as he's negotiating a very tricky landscape with nuclear proliferation and other things going on in the world. So this is Eisenhower basically hoping that there won't be more war. And of course, we all know he ends up being one of the people that plays a major role in ensuring that there's not another war, at least for some time. The soldier passionately believes that with the same determination, the same optimistic resolution, and the same mutual consideration among allies, that marshaled in Europe forces capable of crushing what had been the greatest war machine of history, the problems of peace can and must be met. He sees the United Nations strong but considerate, humane and understanding leaders in the world to preserve the peace he is winning. By United Nations here, he does not mean the United Nations, the organization, which hadn't been founded yet. He's talking about basically the allies here, the allied nations who are united in defeating Nazi Germany in Europe and Imperial Japan in the Pacific. So again, he's talking here about the needs of the post-war world. What is the world going to look like as it moves toward peace after World War II? And I think basically sort of underlying here is that the United States will, of course, have to play a major role in that as one of the only two superpowers that emerged from World War II. In our hearts and minds, there is no slightest doubt that people's spirit of determination, which has buoyed us up and driven us forward in Europe, will continue to fire this nation through the ordeals of battle yet to come. Though we dream of return to our loved ones, we are ready, as we have always been, to do our duty to our country, no matter what it may be. In this spirit, we renew our pledge of service to Commander-in-Chief President Truman, under whose strong leadership we know that final victory is certain. This is the concluding paragraph of Eisenhower's speech. Again, alluding to the post-war world, alluding to the fact that everyone hopes for peace, but America stands ready to fight again if need be. The nod to President Truman there is interesting. Truman and Eisenhower got along and worked very well together when Truman was president and Eisenhower was still General Eisenhower. Truman actually suggested to Eisenhower that Eisenhower could run for president as a Democratic candidate in 1948 if he wished, and that Truman himself would step aside and allow Ike to run for president. Eisenhower at that point had no interest in doing that. He went and became the president of Columbia University in New York City. And then when NATO was created, Truman actually called Eisenhower back to active duty and had for Eisenhower to serve as the commander-in-chief, the first supreme commander of NATO. And then it was during that point, while he was commanding NATO, that there was kind of a grassroots movement here in the States to draft Eisenhower as a presidential candidate in 1952. He finally, after some time, agreed to stand for election as a Republican. That, of course, did not please Truman very well, since he had offered Eisenhower his own job in 1948 as a Democrat. And then, of course, when Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, like any presidential candidate, he ran kind of against the current administration. And so he said some things that Truman didn't appreciate, and that kind of cooled their relationship off quite a bit. And some other things took place as well that really sort of drove Truman and Eisenhower apart. They somewhat came back together in 1963 when they both attended the funeral of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy. So looking at this speech and looking at the Guildhall speech and some of the early experiences Eisenhower had as the Supreme Allied Commander, what can we say we've learned about Eisenhower here? And these are kind of the 6 takeaways that I offer to those of you watching and listening, and maybe there are others as well. But I think these kind of encapsulate everything we've learned from about Eisenhower during this presentation. First is Eisenhower was certainly willing to make hard decisions and take full responsibility and full accountability for them. I think that is shown in the correspondence with Lee Mallory about the possibility of the high casualty rate among the airborne paratroopers. I think it's shown as well in the in case of failure message that I had up on screen, in which Eisenhower takes full responsibility if the invasion of Normandy fails. There's a really interesting thing too in that note that I didn't point out when I had it on the screen, but the original draft that he wrote, where he says, you know, the landings have failed to gain a foothold, and the troops originally said the troops have been withdrawn. He crossed that out and changed it to "I have withdrawn the troops." So again, taking responsibility. And then that last line where he says that the troops, the air and the Navy did all that was possible. If any fault is attached, it is mine alone. Obviously, Eisenhower is very willing to make the hard decisions and to let everybody know they're his decisions, and he will take the heat for them if they fail. On the other hand, when the things that Eisenhower worked on succeeded, he was very quick to give credit to others. And so he didn't say, you know, oh, I was right and you were all wrong or anything like that. He was very, very quick to share credit. Number 2, Eisenhower possessed excellent organizational skills. Clearly, that's the case for the man that was in charge of planning this incredibly detailed and complex invasion of Normandy, and then continuing to push the army forward for almost another year before the Nazis finally surrendered. So we know he had excellent organizational skills. This actually played out quite a bit in his earlier career too, in that Eisenhower himself never commanded troops in battle until he became the Supreme Allied Commander. And so, but he was so highly regarded as an organizer and an administrator and a brilliant staff officer that there was very little consternation about making him the Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Torch, and then later for Operation Husky and Operation Overlord, which of course the latter being D-Day. So we know he had outstanding organizational and administrative skills. Number 3, he was very diplomatic. He had to be diplomatic to work with all of the different countries and representatives of those countries, not just diplomatic in terms of dealing with foreign presidents or prime ministers, but also foreign military officers. He had to be diplomatic to work with people like Montgomery from the UK or de Gaulle from France. So he had excellent diplomatic skills, some of which he learned earlier in his career in a number of overseas postings. He had actually been posted to France between World War I and World War II when he was working on writing a guidebook to World War I battlefields on which the American forces had fought. So his diplomatic skills and his knowledge of France and the French people is one of the reasons he was chosen to lead the Allies in the invasion of Normandy. As I mentioned previously, he was very quick to share credit. He always gave subordinates and allies all the credit. He didn't, heap compliments on himself. He did that to everyone else. And he famously said during his presidency that there was so much that could be accomplished if you just didn't worry about who got the credit. Good things can be done and can happen. So this is something that stayed with him, throughout his military career and into his presidency as well. Following World War II, he understood the need for the United States to maintain an active international role. This is really critical when we talk about the differences between how the United States approached the world after World War I, when there was much more of an isolationist sentiment, maybe not as much as some historians have claimed, but certainly it was far more isolationist in view than after World War II. At the end of World War II, Eisenhower, Truman, many people realized the U.S. had to play an active role in the world. It was one of the only two superpowers in the world, and the U.S. If the U.S. remained engaged in the world, then potentially another world war would hopefully be avoided in the future. And there was some talk that had the U.S. been more engaged with Europe prior to World War II, that the rise of Hitler may have been averted or taken care of much earlier. So Eisenhower certainly recognized that the U.S. had to maintain international relations after World War II, and that obviously, of course, carried through into his presidency as well, when he had a number of great accomplishments in foreign policy. And then finally, he was dedicated to preventing future conflicts. And there were a number of allusions in several of these speeches that we looked at here today, where he talked about, wanting peace and desiring peace, still being willing to fight for the things that matter, but really wanting to be a champion of peace. And if you look at the image that you see there in the background of this slide, that's an aerial view of the Eisenhower statue we have here on our grounds at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. And if you can see it sort of in front of the statue, the words "Champion of Peace" are carved into the stone. So at this point, I will stop talking and I will ask if anyone has any questions. I want to call your attention to this final image here. This is an image from inside our museum here at the library, and we love this quote from Ike, and I think it sums up everything that he believed, which is, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can." And I think that is certainly reflected in a lot of the things he said in the Congressional speech, in the Guildhall speech, and also a lot of the things he did moving forward when he became president. So thank you very much for being on today, and I'll happily entertain questions now if there are any.
Dr. Arrington, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I want you to know that we got a note in the chat from someone who's been watching it from Buenos Aires. So,
oh, wow.
The miracles of the internet world allow us to reach out even beyond our borders. Now, we hear a lot about speechwriters in political context. You've spoken about two speeches that we think of him as President Eisenhower. He was General Eisenhower when he was giving these speeches. Did he write these speeches himself, or did he engage a speechwriter? Do you know the answer to that question? Has that kind of research been done?
Yeah, for the most part, these were written by him. He did get advice and tips on a few things from others, but in the Guildhall speech that he gave in London, he not only wrote that, he memorized the whole thing. He spoke on a balcony with no podium in front of him. He had memorized the entire speech because he had written it himself. The Congressional speech, he did in fact he had the speech in front of him, and and I didn't include this quote in the presentation, but he even said at the beginning of the speech that I'm paraphrasing, but that he liked to not have to use notes, but in this case, he hoped that the congressman would forgive him for breaking with his own tradition and using notes. So he did have a copy of the speech in front of him.
And you yourself served in the Army.
I did, yes.
And how do you think your own service in the Army influenced the way you approach the scholarship around President Eisenhower?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, my service was, 50 years after after Eisenhower's, but I mean, I certainly think that well, I'll give you an even better example. Is yesterday, just yesterday, we had 125 men and women here from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, who are attending the Command and General Staff College there at Fort Leavenworth, which Eisenhower himself graduated from first in his class in the 1920s. These were all foreign military leaders, officers from the militaries of many different countries who are here in Kansas, studying and trying to improve their professional knowledge. And, they were all very interested in Eisenhower's military career, of course, because that was the same career that they had chosen. And they had lots of great questions and lots of great compliments about General Eisenhower, who, again, we're talking about, World War II as being 80 years ago. But Eisenhower is still revered as a great commander and a great humanitarian as well. Again, I worked a summer in Eisenhower's home in Gettysburg 30 years ago, which was right after that is when I went into the service. So he was something of an inspiration for me too, I guess. I think I put more of that on my dad, who had also served, and me wanting to do it for that reason. But Eisenhower was certainly an inspiration for me as well. So I think that, somebody like Eisenhower, who didn't dream of a military career, he went to West Point because he came from a poor family in Kansas, and it was a free college education. He's not someone who sat around, as a young man or as a child dreaming about becoming a soldier. He went because it was the only way he could get an education. And then, of course, became so dedicated to this career and became so successful because he put all of his heart and soul into it. So I think he's a great example of the great things about this country and some of the great people that it has produced. He was not a perfect man by any means; none of us are, but he was a great man, worthy of study and worthy of this beautiful facility here in Kansas at his home.
You've worked both for the Garfield Museum and the Eisenhower Museum. Do you have any thoughts about how those two presidents compare and the challenges that they faced at the time they were leading?
Well, I mean, certainly they're both generals. Although Eisenhower was a career military officer, Garfield was not. He served for a few years during the Civil War, but both Republicans. Although that's doesn't mean the same thing necessarily in 1880 that it does in 1952 or 56. But I think both men who really represented a lot of some of the original sort of views of what the Republican Party was meant to be. A party that was dedicated to equality and equality of opportunity for all. Those things certainly were important to James Garfield, and they certainly were important, 70 years later to Dwight Eisenhower. So, I tend to think of Ulysses S. Grant maybe as a little bit more of a comparison for Eisenhower. Both West Pointers, both career military, although Grant had a break in service. Both Republicans who served 2 full terms as president, and both, I'm happy to say, presidents who have been and are still being reassessed by historians. The line on Grant used to be, great general, mediocre president. Now that view is kind of shifting as historians do more research on, what he did to protect formerly enslaved people in the South. Created the Department of Justice to fight the Ku Klux Klan. Something similar has happened with Eisenhower, where when Eisenhower left the presidency at the beginning of 1961, he was viewed as kind of an average, middling president. Nice guy, liked to play a lot of golf, didn't really do a whole lot. And that view has completely shifted, thanks in large part to the research that's done in this facility here in Abilene, Kansas. As more and more things have become declassified, historians have realized that Eisenhower was in fact extremely involved in every aspect of his administration. He played an active role in every decision that was made. The difference being that he didn't go out and brag about everything that was being done. He didn't run to do a press conference every day to tell the American people everything that was being done. So he just went about the job quietly, did the job, and when his 8 years were up, he left. So I think there's a lot of similarities there between Grant and Eisenhower, maybe more so than Garfield and Eisenhower. Garfield and Eisenhower and Lincoln, of course, my three favorites, though.
Well, now, do you think that, tell us what you think about why did Eisenhower choose to give that speech to Congress before he went home to Kansas? He just he was a victorious general. He'd won the war. He could have done it almost anywhere. Why did he choose that venue?
Well, I mean, I think the easiest answer is because he was invited. He was invited and asked to come and address Congress. But it would have been very easy for him to write a very different speech that was very celebratory and chest thumping and really talking about how we won the war and we were victorious. Really kind of a lot more celebratory than I think would have been natural for him anyway. But I think the fact that he gave the speech and really was dedicated to talking about the importance of the alliance and the allies, giving equal credit to the British and the French and the Soviets even. I think that just shows who Eisenhower was, and it certainly translated into how he governed later when he became president. About 4 days after he gave this speech to Congress, he was back here in Abilene, Kansas, and he was able to also speak to the citizens of Abilene. And I mentioned when I was talking about the Guildhall address, one of our favorite quotes here is when he told the people of Great Britain, "I come from the very heart of America." One of our other favorite quotes is a line from the speech he gave here in Abilene, which is where he told the citizens of Abilene, "The proudest thing I can claim is that I am from Abilene."
And do you think, did this speech have any motion in terms of congressional support for the Marshall Plan? Was that, we think of the kind of controversies that Congress engages about investing in the world.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, well, first of all, it's important to note that General Marshall, who later became Secretary of State Marshall, he was Eisenhower's boss. Marshall himself was very similar to Eisenhower in that he was revered as a staff officer, as an administrator, as an organizer. So Marshall saw a lot of himself in Eisenhower. Marshall is the one that brought Eisenhower to Washington towards the end of 1941, right as the United States was getting into the war, brought Eisenhower to Washington as the chief of the War Plans Division. And then Eisenhower's career accelerated very quickly because of how much talent he showed and being someone who was close to Marshall. Marshall actually was hoping to be given command of Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion. President Roosevelt told Marshall that he was too valuable. He needed to keep Marshall in Washington. So who else would he recommend? And Marshall did not hesitate to say Eisenhower. I think that some of the things Eisenhower said in this speech sort of foreshadow almost the Marshall Plan, where he's talking about the need to continue to help these countries even during peacetime. And then, of course, you think then about the fact that as soon as the war was over, the U.S. and the Soviet Union kind of reverted to their pre-war antagonism of one another, and it became very clear very quickly that communism and capitalism, the Soviets and the Americans were going to be very much against one another during this period of the Cold War, and the need to really rebuild Western Europe in America's image in some respects, and with American goods and with American charity, to make sure that yes, that we truly help these countries, but also to very specifically tie them to the United States, both economically and politically, so that they would not fall prey to communism, rather.
So here's our final question.
Okay.
Did Eisenhower ever compare his two careers, the military and the presidency? You know, which one was more satisfying? Which one did he feel more, you know, like he had got more done? Did he ever have that kind of conversation?
Maybe not necessarily, you know, I'm sure he did have those private conversations. You know, I think there were things about both of these careers that he found rewarding and that he enjoyed. I do think it's important to remember that a man who spent, you know, almost 40 years in active military service wanted to be remembered as a man of peace. I think that's really important. So that certainly speaks to the importance he placed on peace, and that was really at the forefront of his foreign policy while serving as president. But then again, when he left the presidency, he was very happy when President Kennedy allowed him to basically be reverted to his rank of five-star general, so that for the rest of his life, he was called General Eisenhower rather than President Eisenhower. And he certainly seemed to prefer the general, which I think he felt like maybe he earned that title more so than he earned the presidency, even though millions of people had to vote for him to become president. And then finally, the last thing I'll say about that is that when Eisenhower died in 1969, he was interred in a building here on our campus. So he and now his wife and their firstborn son, who died in childhood, are both here on our campus interred. He was buried in a standard $80 GI coffin, and he was buried in his military uniform. And so I think that also says something about the centrality of the military experience to his life.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Arrington. And you'll be happy to know that one of our listeners works with the National Park Service Eisenhower Memorial here in DC, and she's going to share this presentation with her colleagues because many of these quotes are at that memorial. So
Sure.
If you're Washingtonians, take a minute to go look and see it. Excuse me. We are moving forward with our next events. We want to thank you. You can take down your screen share so that we can put up the screen share for, excuse me a minute. You know, as is the Washington way, we'll be taking a little bit of break for August. And our next webinar is coming up on Thursday, September 4th, when we are going to talk about Richard Neuberger, Oregon politics and the making of a United States Senator. We think there are so many fabulous stories amidst the members of Congress. And part of our work is not to just talk about the building, but the people who work in the building. So we invite you to come and learn a little bit about one of our senators. And we hope that you appreciate these kind of public history opportunities. As we said before, they are available on our website. Please share them with others. They're open educational resources available for anyone. But they're only available because you make donations to the United States Capitol Historical Society. While we are chartered by Congress, we are not funded by Congress. We are funded by the generosity of our members and donors, and we are grateful, every one of you, for those contributions. Keep those cards and letters coming. Thank you, Dr. Arrington, for contributing your time. We're grateful to have you with us. Everybody try to find a way to stay cool and enjoy the summer. Be well. Goodbye.